wonderful game. Hey! And together till the end of the day. 1, 2, 3, go. Salam, salam, aleinu ve'kol ha'olam. Salam, salam, ve'al salam, aleinu ve'kol ha'olam. Salam, salam, this time for Africa.
Those guys are a lot of fun. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was Keepa Live doing their It's Time for Africa medley. Right now, it's time for AT Daily. How are you? It's a Monday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us as we do a little learning, some very interesting learning on, pardon me, on Monday night. Paula in Chicago, Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina, Stephen in Dover, New Hampshire, James in Indianapolis, Melissa in Great Neck, Brenna in Sharon, Mass, Nancy in North Carolina, Shmuela in Washington, Chaim in Charlotte, Tom in Pennsylvania, Gail in Virginia, Renee says Indy in the house, Lucy in Minnesota, Shelly in Lawrenceville, Georgia, Christo Cheney, good evening from Lubbock, Texas. I had kosher beef bacon once from Grow and Behold in New York, expensive but well worth it. We're going to be talking about the possibility of kosher bacon. Now, certainly you could cut, that kind of part of the cow that might resemble the consistency of bacon and maybe add some maple syrup or something and flavor it. But we're talking about something else, right? It's not meat that comes from a cow, but something that is flavored specifically to taste like pork. We will be talking about that. Pauline, shalom from Arkansas. Lindsay, shalom aleichem from Cincinnati. Sonia says turkey bacon. Sharon says erev tov from Lebanon, New Jersey. Lana from Michigan. Rochelle says Modesto says hello. And I guess, who is it? Sharon has tasted Grow and Behold. I've never tasted Grow and Behold. That sounds like I would like it. Umberto says shalom. Anne is here from Merced. Renata from San Antonio. And Sharon says it's expensive, this Grow and Behold place. I need to learn more about that. Over there on the YouTube side, Moshe Hernandez saying shalom from Bogota in Colombia. Bienvenido, Moshe. It's so great you're with us. Lynn is in Texas and Sheila in Montana. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily. Today's January 4th. Tomorrow is 1 year that we have been doing AT Daily. Amazing. And what a strange year it's been. Unimaginable when we started this on January 5th of 2020, what 2020 held. We never could have imagined. So, that's just one more reason why we don't talk about that in the future this will happen or in the future that will happen, because the future is God's business. Who knows what God has in store for us? Tonight's episode of AT Daily, dedicated by Todd Gindy, my friend here in LA, in honor of Shlomo, by which he means Rabbi Shlomo Seidenfeld, who's just a fixture here in Aish, Los Angeles. Just an amazing guy and a dear friend, a regular contributor to our table for five. I'm so happy to dedicate tonight's learning in honor of Rabbi Shlomo Seidenfeld. May you and your family be blessed with infinite blessings. Todd, may you and your family be blessed with infinite blessings. We say amen. And if you ever get a chance to learn with Rabbi Shlomo Seidenfeld out of Los Angeles, run, don't walk. He is so sweet and so deep. Also, tonight's class is dedicated by Michael Finkelstein for a healing of his good friend Shelley. May we only hear good news about Shelley, a refuah shlema, of a complete healing of body, mind, spirit. We should only hear good news. May Shelley's whole family, may your whole family, Michael, be showered in blessings, and we say amen. Thank you for your dedication tonight. All right, where are we holding? This is Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. We are on Daf Mem Daled, that's page 44. We're in chapter 3 and continuing our discussion of the first Mishna of chapter 3. Let me just put that aside. Get my Gemara here. Okay, so the issue at hand is so we've been talking about what is chametz and when do we become liable for eating it. So chametz is leaven. Leaven during Passover is prohibited to a Jew, and specifically what's prohibited is leavened bread, right? So that for sure, if you eat leavened bread on purpose during the Passover holiday, so then you are subject to charis, right? Death at the hands of the heavenly court. It's a severe transgression. If you do it unwittingly, you become liable to bring a sin offering if and when the temple is standing, and when Mashiach comes, the temple will be back. But then the question is, well, what if you just mix leaven in with other things? And then as we've discovered yesterday, so the Torah rates that as it's a prohibition. Very often things are prohibited in the Torah, and so if you violate that, you're liable on a biblical level. And then, for something that's a lesser offense, as it were, a lesser included offense, the rabbis will prohibit it. You don't become liable to bring a sin offering if you do it unwittingly, but it's still prohibited. Here, the Torah makes a distinction between if you eat full-fledged chametz, you'd be guilty of, you'd be liable to receive charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court. If you eat chametz mixed with other things during Passover, it's still prohibited, not just by the rabbis, but by the Torah itself. However, it's a lower degree prohibition, and you would receive lashes under very specific circumstances that are very unusual indeed. But the point is, it's an offense at a lower level than death at the hands of the heavenly court. It would just be lashes, as it were. So now we're continuing this discussion of, well, when have you eaten a mixture of chametz and something else? And now we're going to discover a general principle. As we've seen, to say that you're guilty of eating something, well, that's going to have a minimum measure, right? So the word eating is kind of a defined term. Any of the lawyers out there will understand that when you write up a contract between two parties who are entering into a deal, certain words which have a normal definition in everyday English are going to acquire a specific definition for the purposes of the contract. So likewise, eating generally means to us, so you put it in your mouth, you ate it. But for the sages of the Talmud, eating is going to have a more specific meaning than that. And depending on the context of what's being eaten, there's going to be a minimum measure. And if you eat less than that, you didn't do anything because it was too insignificant for you to become guilty of eating, for example, a prohibited substance. So we're going to be talking about minimum measure. And once you're talking about minimum measure, well, if you ate such a tiny amount today and another tiny amount tomorrow, and you just say this tiny amount, like once a day, at one point, does it eventually add up that you ate the minimum measure and you became liable for that transgression? Or is there also a minimum or a maximum time limit within which you have to have eaten the minimum measure? So those are the kinds of questions we're going to be talking about today. So the first question is, well, what happens if you eat something that's prohibited, but it's a small amount, it's mixed with something that would normally be permitted? Now you have this mixture of prohibited and permitted, and the mixture adds up to the minimum measure for it to be defined as eating. But since it's a mixture, the amount of the prohibited substance is definitely less than the minimum measure to trigger liability for violating this prohibition on eating something prohibited. So if the mixture is the minimum measure, have we actually eaten something prohibited? That's the question that is asked. And we get an answer from Rabbi Abahu in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So here we go. We've been discussing whether eating leaven in a mixture could trigger this liability, eating chametz in a mixture. So now we're going to talk more generally about eating something prohibited in a mixture. Rabbi Abahu said that Rabbi Yochanan said, with regard to all prohibitions of the Torah, a permitted substance does not join together with a prohibited substance. If one eats a permitted food with a prohibited food, and together they constitute the minimum prohibited measure, just the minimum, right? Then this person is exempt from punishment for this act of consumption, right? And it kind of makes sense intuitively if you think about it, because let's say that what is the prohibited thing? So the prohibited thing could be like, for example, pork, right? A Jew cannot eat pork at all, anytime. But for him to become liable for eating this non-kosher substance, he'd have to eat the minimum measure, okay? Now, I don't know if that's a good example, but here we're saying general principles, and it seems to be saying, okay, so that the minimum measure for most things, when we're talking about whether you ate a prohibited substance and became liable or not, and we've been talking about leaven during Passover, maybe we should stick to that for right now. Did you eat chametz on Passover? I don't want to say chametz on Passover because now I'm not recalling whether this might be a strict liability, and even less than the normal measure is going to render you liable. So just in general, okay, if you eat the olive, and what is the minimum measure? It's an olive bulk, a kazayas, right? So that's a volume of food about the size of a big fat olive. So until you eat that much of the prohibited food, you haven't really eaten. Well, now the prohibited food is mixed with permitted food, and you eat an olive volume, a kazayas of this mixture. So what you know is that you ate less than a kazayas, less than an olive volume of the prohibited food. So it makes sense, according to Rabbi Abahu in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that this mixture, which contains prohibited food, and you're eating an olive volume of the mixture, should not trigger this liability because the prohibited food is definitely less than the olive volume. However, this principle applies to all halachos, at least according to Rabbi Yochanan, except for the prohibitions of a nazir. So the nazir who is liable for eating a mixture of that kind. The nazir is the one who takes a vow that he will not drink or benefit from the grapevine. No one put a gun to his head and told him to take that vow. He wanted to be extra pious. When a nazir takes that vow, it's going to be for a time limit. The standard one would be for 30 days, for a month. So the nazir would say, for 1 month, I'm not going to partake of anything that has to do with the grapevine. I'm not going to drink wine. I'm not going to eat raisins. I'm not going to eat grapes. He also doesn't cut his hair until the days of his naziris are ended. Then he has to bring certain offerings to the temple, and then he will have completed his naziris, and then those items that were prohibited to him during the days of his vow will become permitted to him again. Now, in the case of the nazir, who is he is liable for eating a mixture of this kind. In other words, he's going to be liable for eating less than the olive volume of the grape product when it's mixed with something else. Why? As the Torah said with regard to the nazir, he shall abstain from, this is Numbers 6:3, he shall abstain from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar of wine or vinegar of strong drink, nor shall he drink anything soaked in grapes. This verse indicates that a nazir is prohibited from consuming not only wine and vinegar, but also any food that was soaked in these liquids. So even though he hasn't consumed that olive volume of what is prohibited to him, it's permitted to others, but it's prohibited to him, even though he hasn't consumed that minimum volume, it was mixed, let's say, with bread soaked in wine, he's still going to trigger that liability because the verse about taking the Naziris vow seems to say, also includes this stipulation that he can't even eat things soaked in wine. So the mixture is going to trigger liability for him. Now, Zeri said, permitted and prohibited substances also combine with regard to the prohibition against offering leaven on the altar. So Zeri is saying there's going to be another example where the mixture, you can have even less than the minimum measure, and it's still going to trigger liability if the mixture is equal to the minimum measure. His example is going to be that when we bring offerings on the altar, when the temple is standing, many of the offerings are accompanied by bread, and that bread must be unleavened, right? It must be chametz free. It must be like the matzah of Passover, though for a different reason. This is not a recollection of the Exodus from Egypt. It's just that God said so, that when you bring offerings on the altar, they shall be accompanied by unleavened bread. And so we have at Leviticus 2:11, for no leaven and no honey shall be offered as a burnt offering before the Lord. And this indicates that one is also liable for sacrificing leaven even in a mixture, in addition to the liability for sacrificing pure leaven on the altar. So it would seem that this is another example of where the mixture can be the minimum measure, even though the prohibited substance is not in the minimum measure, and it would trigger liability for the person who, in this case, brings that offering on the altar. And so where do we see that? And hold on a second. And let me just keep reading that. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. If so, with regard to the matter of leavened bread on Passover, one should also be liable for eating a prohibited substance joined together with a permitted substance. But as we've seen, the Torah has already made that distinction, as the sages derived yesterday, right? So that if you eat chametz bread, right, leavened bread during Passover, okay, that's charis. But if you eat it in a mixture, it's a prohibition. It's a Torah prohibition. It leads to lashes. It's just not at the same level as charis. So if so, with regard to the matter of leavened bread on Passover, one should also be liable for eating a prohibited substance joined together with a permitted substance. And the Gemara answers, yeah, indeed it is so. And the prohibition mentioned by Zeiri against sacrificing leaven in offerings in the temple was only to exclude the statement of Abaye, who said there is significance to offering less than an olive bulk of leaven on the altar, and one is flogged. One receives lashes for sacrificing an offering of that kind. By noting that one is liable because permitted substances combine with prohibited substances, the Baraisa teaches that an offering of less than an olive bulk is not considered an offering, and therefore sacrificing is not punishable by lashes. So interesting. If you sacrifice an olive bulk, a kizayas, right, of something mixing chametz, which should not be offered on the altar, with something else that may be offered on the altar, and the mixture together adds up to this olive bulk of food, so then this person receives lashes. Will be, is technically liable to receive lashes. But if what he brings in a mixture is less than the olive bulk, he does not get lashes. Why? Because he hasn't brought anything at all, right? So if it's less than the olive bulk, no matter whatever is inside it, it's like he did nothing at all because the amount isn't enough to be considered an offering. More than an olive bulk, yes, it's an offering, and if it contains any leaven at all, even though the leaven, the chametz, is less than an olive bulk itself, he would be liable to receive lashes for violating that prohibition. Abaye asked Rav Dimi, hold on a second. So that I think is going to be on the next page. Okay, Abaye asked Rav Dimi, is eating a kizayas, an olive bulk, of something prohibited in the time that it takes to... I'm sorry. I thought I put that on Do Not Disturb. Okay. So here is the question. Let me... what happened to me? Yes, Abaye asked Rav Dimi, is eating an olive bulk, a kizayas, in the time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread prohibited by Torah law, and one is punished for it? And Rav Dimi answered him, yes. So now we're saying that there's a minimum measure to trigger this liability. That's the kizayas. and a maximum amount of time within which you did it, right? So if you, in other words, if you ate an olive, the minimum measure, but you ate just a nibble here and a nibble there, and it took, an hour to do it, so then you didn't do it. That again does not constitute that minimum measure to be considered eating. The minimum, action to be considered eating under Torah law is that you ate an olive's volume of the food, and you did so in the amount of time that it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. That's a defined term within Talmudic law. And estimates range on what is to eat half a loaf of bread. First of all, a loaf of bread is defined as 6 egg volumes. So half a loaf is 3 egg volumes. Right? So imagine like a bread roll that has the volume of 3 eggs. And people would say that, so then you could say, well, how fast is the guy eating? Is he scarfing it down? Is he chewing carefully? And sort of estimates range among the commentators anywhere from 2 to 9 minutes, right? So let's say at the outer range, 9 minutes. So if it takes you 10 minutes to eat this olive volume, you didn't really eat, right? So that's what Abaye establishes with his teacher, Rav Dimi. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer said, chametz in a mixture like kutach is prohibited by Torah law, but the rabbis said it is permitted by Torah law. Why? So this we already ran into a couple days ago, right? Kutach, what is kutach? We've discussed it several times. It was a pungent dairy dip that was used as a condiment, as a spice in Talmudic times. And it was made, and it was really in Bavel, in Babylonia, the Jewish community in Babylonia, which is part of the Persian Empire. And it was a mix of sour milk, moldy bread, and very strong salt, sodomite salt. So you think like, that does not sound good. But there's a lot of foods that if you think about it, like blue cheese, right? What is that? That's moldy cheese. And yet people love it. I'm not so partial to it, but I know people love it. But this kutak, if you made it properly, apparently it was very tasty. So then the question was, since it has moldy bread in it, not a lot, but just a little bit for the flavor, and if you ate that during Passover, okay, so that's chametz in a mixture. Rabbi Eliezer said, if you eat that during Passover, you're liable. You're liable for eating chametz on Passover. And then we could say liable for what? Is it full on kares? Probably not. It would probably be more lashes in that mixture. But the rabbi said you're not liable for anything under Torah law. Now, it's prohibited by rabbinic decree for sure, but you're not liable to that punishment under Torah law according to the rabbis. And we had trouble understanding that. Why were the rabbis so lenient, at least with respect to their ruling on Torah law? And now we can understand that. Why? Because a person who's eating kutach is actually not going to eat a whole olive volume of it in that short amount of time, right? Why? Because he just dips his bread in it, right? Now you might say, well, some people really scoop up ketchup, when they're eating it with French fries. They eat quite a bit of it, certainly more than an olive volume. But I guess this kutach was particularly pungent, and you really were just getting a little bit of flavor, maybe it was a little bit more like soy sauce. Like you really only needed a little bit to add a lot of flavor, and so a person wouldn't be consuming that much of it under normal circumstances that it would be considered eating. And that's why the rabbi said it wasn't a violation of Torah law. Now someone might say, well, what if a person did eat it like that? Some people are crazy and they just spoon up their ketchup and maybe somebody just really likes this kutach and doesn't care how pungent it is and he really eats a large amount in a short time. And that still wouldn't trigger liability because when the rabbis make laws like this, issue decrees and their interpretations of Torah laws, they're talking about the average person, usually. There's exceptions, of course. But since it is anomalous, it's unusual, it's weird, in fact, it's a weird form of eating for somebody to spoon up a condiment like kutach and just eat a lot of it all at once, they aren't going to issue a decree for that very unusual circumstance, and therefore that person would not be considered to have eaten and would not have triggered that liability. Okay, that is abnormal eating. Then the Gemara asks, Okay, so with regard to this, and tonight's class is going to be on the short side, so if you've got questions, comments, make sure you get them in there now. The Gemara asks, okay, with respect to this passage about the vow of the Nazir, right, that he's not only prohibited to eat grapes, raisins, wine, grape juice, vinegar made from wine or grape juice, etc., but even anything that is soaked in grapes, right? And so from this word soaked, we pulled out that, okay, that in the case of the Nazir, even a mixture the bread and the wine in an olive's volume will trigger liability, whereas at least according to Rabbi Yochanan, normally you need to eat an olive volume of the prohibited substance before you trigger the liability, not the prohibited substance mixed with a permitted substance. Now, with respect to the word soaked in that verse, the Gemara says, well, does this word soaked come to teach about mixtures in general or just in that case, right? Because it seems like what Rabbi Yochanan said, permitted and prohibited do not add up to form the minimum measure, except in the case of the Nazir. So now the Gemara brings this other baraisa, which says, well, soaked does teach that the taste of substances is like the substance. So let's read that. So with regard to this word soaked, from here you derive a law. Let me back up a little bit. The Gemara returns to its discussion of Rabbi Abahu's statement with regard to the meaning of the word soaked in the verse, he shall abstain from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar of wine or vinegar of strong drink, nor shall he drink anything soaked in grapes. And whether or not a permitted substance combines with a prohibited one. The Gemara asks, and does this word soaked come to teach that mixtures are prohibited in this case? That verse is required to teach that which was taught in a baraisa elsewhere. In other words, if the word soaked, does it actually mean that for the Nazir, prohibited and permitted substances that add up to an olive's volume trigger his liability? Maybe we're not free to say that the word soaked can be interpreted that way and teaches that law because this word soaked is actually used by the sages to teach a different law. What law is that? We learned in a baraisa. Soaked comes to establish the principle that the legal status of the taste of a forbidden food is like that of its substance. So now we're not talking about whether the combined mixture, permitted and prohibited, that adds up to an olive volume is going to trigger liability or not. Rather, we're going to say that even if you're eating something in less than the minimum measure to trigger liability for violating a prohibition, if the small amount that you're eating carries the taste of the prohibited substance, then it does trigger that liability, even though it's less than the minimum measure. Listen here. The term teaches that any food that absorbs the taste of a prohibited item assumes the status of the prohibited item itself, as in a case where one soaked grapes in water and the water has the taste of wine, a Nazirite is liable for drinking this mixture as it assumes the taste of wine. So imagine that you took like wine grapes and you just let them sitting in water for a long time, maybe even the lees of a wine press, right? And you just let them soak in water, and then you pull that water out. Now the grapes and the skins and everything are still lying there at the bottom. But the water that you pull out is going to have some of that flavor of the lees of the wine press, right? The leftovers of the wine press. So can the Nazir drink that? It's definitely, he's not drinking wine. He's just drinking water that absorbed the taste of wine, and that is going to be prohibited. So that seems to teach the law that if something absorbs the taste of something prohibited, then this thing which absorbed the taste of the prohibited thing will itself become prohibited. From here you derive the halacha, the law, with regard to the entire Torah, says the Gemara. In all cases, the legal status of the taste of a forbidden food is like that of its substance. the Gemara elaborates. Just as with regard to a Nazir, whose prohibition against eating grapes is not an eternal prohibition. So here what the Gemara is going to do is it's going to make a Kal V'chomer argument. It's going to say that, the Nazir, he's prohibited to eat grapes during the time of his Naziris. He didn't have to take that on. He can get out of it, and eventually he's going to be allowed to eat grapes again. Nevertheless, while he's in his term, if he eats something that just has the taste of grapes, that's going to trigger liability for him that he violated a prohibition. If that's the case for this prohibition, which is temporary and only particular to one person and which can be dissolved if he goes to a sage and says, when I took that vow of Naziris, I was crazy. I didn't realize how difficult it would be. Can you nullify? Can you dissolve my vow for me? And he can get out of his vow if it's canceled by a sage under certain circumstances. Well, then how much more when we're talking about substances that are prohibited all the time, that if their taste is imparted to some other substance and then you eat the substance that carries the taste of the prohibited item, how much more so that substance should be prohibited because it absorbed the taste of something which is prohibited, not just, during the 30 days of one person's vow not to eat it, but is prohibited at all times and to all Jews. That's going to be the argument. So just as with regard to a Nazir, whose prohibition against eating grapes is not an eternal prohibition, as he will be permitted to eat grapes once his period of Naziris is over, and furthermore, his prohibition is not a prohibition against deriving benefit from wine. He's not allowed to consume it, but he can actually own wine even while he's a Nazir. He doesn't have to sell all the wine in his cellar. He just can't drink it. And there is a dissolution for his prohibition against eating grape products by requesting a sage to release him from his vow. And nevertheless, in his case, the Torah rendered the legal status of the taste of food forbidden to him like that of its substance. Well, then with regard to a forbidden mixture of diverse kinds, right? So for example, if you planted a grapevine and squash plant in the same garden plot very close to each other, that would be that you have violated the Torah's prohibition on kilayim, planting diverse kinds together, and those things will never be permitted if they grew too close together, because that's just one of those chukim, one of those supra-rational laws. We can't understand why, but God said so, and so we don't eat that. So with regard to a forbidden mixture of diverse kinds, whose prohibition is an eternal prohibition, and whose prohibition is a prohibition against deriving benefit, not only can you not eat it, you can't even own the product of that garden where they were grown together, and there is no dissolution of this prohibition. You can't go to a sage and request he dissolve this prohibition for you. It's forever. As it is it not right that the Torah should render the legal status of the taste of its forbidden food like that of its substance? And that's how we get this general law. And indeed, this is the law. If a mixture of wine and another substance has the taste of wine, the substance is prohibited to a Nazir as though it were wine. And the same principle applies to other foods that absorb the taste of a prohibited item. That is the law. So now that we've learned that if you absorb the taste of a prohibited item, then even though there's very tiny little bit of that prohibited item in this other food that would otherwise be permitted, and now it becomes prohibited because it has the taste of something prohibited. So now we might ask, well, what if you are eating, like kosher bacon bits, right? Or like, bacon bits that have the taste of pork. And this exists. For sure it exists. You can get bacon flavored potato chips that really taste like bacon, and they're kosher. They have a hechsher, right? So somebody from one of the certifying authorities went to the factory and examined it and said, no pork products went into this. It just has an artificial flavor, and then they certified it as kosher, not just because it's artificial, but because it fulfilled all the other requirements of a kosher manufacture of food. But it has the taste of bacon. So doesn't that violate the principle that we just learned? And of course the answer is no. It doesn't violate it because there's no actual bacon in those potato chips. There's no actual pork products in the potato chips. It's an imitation. It's an imitation, and that is not going to be prohibited, right? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So for sure, a Jew cannot eat any pork product of any kind, can't eat shrimp, all the non-kosher foods. If any amount of them gets into your food, you can't eat that substance, okay? What about well, we can talk about nullifying amounts, but right now we're talking about if it imparts flavor to the food that you're going to eat. So if you put pork in something and it imparts a pork flavor, for sure, a Jew can't eat that. But what if that pork flavor is generated by something that has no pork in it at all? It's a total imitation. That actually is permitted. We actually have a ruling in Tractate Chulin about that, where there was a story that I think the Yalta, the wife of Rabbi Nachman, really wanted to taste milk and meat together. And she just wondered what it tasted like. And he said, oh, well, you can eat this fish that actually has that flavor. And there was a principle that anything that God took away from us, that we're unable to eat it, but there is something that he gave us which is just as good and which is permitted. So what am I saying? So you can have that flavor if it's an imitation flavor, but it tastes just like the real thing, as long as it's not made from the prohibited substance, it is permitted to eat that thing. However, there's a limitation on all of this, and that is the principle of maris ayin. All right, the appearance to the eye, the appearance of impropriety. Does it look like you're eating a prohibited substance? Now, these days, right, Impossible Burger. I mean, it looks like a hamburger. It tastes pretty much like a hamburger. I mean, depending on how you cook it, how you season it, what you're eating it with, if you get a really good bun, etc. You can make a really good, plant-based burger these days. So if it's a plant-based burger, sure, you could put cheese on it. Kosher cheese, right? But you could melt some kosher cheese on your plant-based burger. You haven't violated the prohibition on eating milk and meat, on cooking milk and meat together. You have not violated that Torah prohibition. But is it okay? It depends, right? If you're eating it in a situation where other Jews will think you're eating a real cheeseburger, that can become problematic for one of two reasons. Either because they will suspect you of eating something that you shouldn't be eating, right? It will cast aspersions on yourself in the eyes of your fellow Jews. Or because you might be eating something that person who's looking at you, he's not sure what the law is, and he'll see you eating it, and then he'll say, oh, okay, well, I guess it's permitted to eat shrimp. I thought shrimp was prohibited, but I guess shrimp is permitted, right? And he doesn't know that you're eating imitation shrimp. So when you have this issue come up of maris ayin, the appearance to the eye, you actually have to deal with it, right? So if there's going to be a situation where it's not going to be obvious that what you're eating, even though it looks like it's unkosher, but in reality it is kosher, then you're going to have to kind of make the situation clear to this other person that might get the wrong idea. So one way of doing that, for example, is like, let's say that you're having a meat dinner, and then at the end you're going to bring out coffee and tea, and people who might want to have milk with their coffee or tea, you're going to serve almond milk, right? It's almond milk, of course, is prohibited. Dairy milk would not be permitted in your coffee after a meat meal if you're Jewish. So what do? You bring out this milk substitute, as it were, and then you also bring out the box. You also bring out the box so that people can see that it is not real milk, that it is some kind of milk substitute. Now, in situations where it's obvious and everyone knows what the score is, you don't have to worry about it. If religious people are over at a religious person's house and they're bringing out this like par of ice cream, non-dairy ice cream, doesn't really look that much like ice cream. It certainly doesn't taste like regular ice cream. It gets better and better, but they would know that you're not bringing out dairy ice cream after your meat meal. But in a situation where it's not quite so obvious what's going on, then you should go a little bit out of your way to make it clear to anybody who might be looking that you're not violating some kind of kosher prohibition, and that what you're eating is some kind of a substitute, whether it's a bacon substitute or a whitener, a milk substitute, or it's a meat substitute, or whatever you're doing. You're being not only careful that you wouldn't violate a kosher prohibition, but you also don't want to violate this maris ayin, this appearance to the eye that you are violating a prohibition. So you put the box on the table or in some other way indicate what it is that you are doing. Okay, now, so Rabbi Yochanan said that the permitted and the prohibited, except in the case of the Nazir, do not add up together to form the requisite minimum volume. Rabbi Akiva does not seem to agree with that, with Rabbi Yochanan on that. So the Gemara states that Rabbi Yochanan holds in accordance. Oh, so wait a minute. Hold on a second. So then later in our daf, it's going to say, well, maybe Rabbi Abahu holds that way, but Rabbi Yochanan elsewhere seems to say that the two things do add up. And when he's saying that they do add up, he seems to be holding like Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva said in a baraisa, as it was taught in a baraisa, Rabbi Yochanan seems to hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva in a baraisa, as it was taught in that baraisa, that Rabbi Akiva says, a Nazirite, a Nazir, who soaked his bread in wine and ate an olive bulk of the mixture from the bread and the wine is liable. Now here, he's not talking about because of the taste imparted to the bread, it's the taste of wine. Rather, he's talking about it's a mixture of wine, which is prohibited to the Nazir, and bread, which is permitted to him, but he's eating an olive bulk of it, a kazayas, and that's going to trigger his liability for breaking his vow. This baraisa indicates that according to Rabbi Akiva, a permitted substance does join together with a prohibited substance to trigger liability. And the Gemara asks, and Rabbi Akiva, from where does he derive the principle So Rabbi Akiva says apparently they do mix together. They do add up together to form the minimum volume. And he's getting that teaching from the bread soaked in another substance of the Nazir. So if he gets that the mixture adds up to fulfill the minimum required volume to trigger liability, then from where does he derive the idea that the taste of something prohibited, when a few little particles of it, have gotten into some other food and made that otherwise permitted food taste like the prohibited food, that now that otherwise permitted food is going to be prohibited because it absorbs the flavor of the prohibited food. If he's not getting that from the bread soaked in wine verse of the Nazir, where does Rabbi Akiva derive that teaching? That the flavor of something prohibited imparts that prohibition to the otherwise permitted substance. Where does he get that? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Akiva derives this principle from the prohibition of meat cooked in milk. In that case, there is merely the taste of the milk absorbed by the meat, and the mixture is nonetheless forbidden. So here too, in the case of other prohibitions, it is no different because it absorbs some of the flavor of something that was prohibited. In other words, what he's saying is, even though very little milk got into the meat, it's enough that it's changing the flavor a little bit, and that's what's going to make the meat prohibited when it has some milk cooked into it. Hold on a second. And then the Gemara asks, well, what about the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva? Why don't they derive this principle of meat from meat cooked in milk? Why do they look to the bread soaked in wine of the Nazir to derive this principle that a prohibited flavor imparts the prohibition to the otherwise permitted food? And the Gemara answers, the rabbis claim that from meat and milk, we do not derive other laws. Why? Because that prohibition is unique. That prohibition is a novelty, is the way the Koran Talmud is translating it. And what does that mean? And the Gemara asks, and what is the novelty of that prohibition? If you say that it is unique in that this meat alone and that milk alone are each permitted and yet together they are forbidden, well, that characteristic is not unique to meat cooked in milk. In the case of prohibited mixtures of diverse kinds, too, this element alone and that element alone, right, the squash growing in the vineyard in the midst of the grapevines, if the squash grew somewhere else, it would be permitted. If the grapes on that grapevine didn't grow with squash plant at their base, they would be permitted. It's only because they're mixed together, in the way that they're grown. So it's not that the putting together of permitted things in a prohibited way that is unique to the meat and milk prohibition that we can't learn other laws from it. And the Gemara answers, rather, the novelty is that if one soaks meat in milk all day, it is permitted by Torah law, right? By Torah law, meaning by rabbinic decree, no. But here's the thing, like if you left your burger, your hamburger meat, soaking in milk all day long, and then, or let's say it's already cooked, right? Your cooked burger, now it's cold, the burger's cold, let's say, and then you left it soaking in a dish of milk all day long. You could technically take that out and eat it by Torah law, not by rabbinic decree. The rabbis absolutely prohibited this. Why would it be permitted by Torah law? Because the Torah prohibition is on cooking meat and milk together. The fact that they were mixed together in a cold dish all day long will not trigger that liability for the violation under Torah law. Still prohibited by the rabbis, 100%. But in terms of the novelty of meat cooked in milk, what makes it an unusual law in the Torah is that only applies if you cook these things together, not if they simply are together. So despite that fact that the meat certainly absorbs some taste of the milk, this would remain permitted by Torah law, whereas if one cooked the meat and the milk, even for a short time, and like it didn't absorb any flavor, it would definitely trigger the liability and the mixture would be prohibited by Torah law. So that's a unique aspect of the milk and meat prohibition and why we don't learn out other laws from it. And Rabbi Akiva will actually agree that is a unique aspect of the milk and meat prohibition, and therefore he's going to learn out the idea that the taste imparted by a prohibited thing to an otherwise permitted food is going to render that permitted food prohibited. Rabbi Akiva is going to say, you're right, I can't learn that out from the milk and meat prohibition. Rather, he's going to learn it from the idea that we have to purge the vessels that were used by idolaters before we can bring them into a Jewish home. In other words, they have to be boiled or actually go through the fire to purge them of all traces of whatever food was eaten in the idolater's home. But we're not going to get into that tonight. That's just the way that Rabbi Akiva will approach that problem. If you're interested, read that toward the end of today's daf. Okay, let us go to your comments and questions. Okay. Nina says, I pretty much answered this, but it's a good question. James asks, what would the ruling be if you eat food today that has no prohibition but has artificial flavoring that makes it taste like a prohibited food? And the answer is, right, it's permitted. It's permitted as long as whatever the artificial flavoring is permitted. And we met, I can't remember his name, Rabbi Gavriel, I forget what his last name was. Great guy. And he's a rabbi who works for the Orthodox Union. And his job is to go to, major food manufacturing concerns. I mean, the type of food that is sold in supermarkets, in millions of stores, millions of people are eating it. It comes from big factories, right? And so many, sort of like large scale food operations are kosher certified. And how do they get that kosher certification? Depending on which is the certifying authority. The OU is one. The Orthodox Union Star K is another. I think Circle K is a different one. There's various certifying authorities, and they will send a rabbi trained in this kind of work to the factory to see how they make it. And one thing that he told me was, I won't say the company, but a big company that makes a peach-flavored iced tea. No peaches were harmed in the making of that iced tea. He said that there's no peaches whatsoever in the peach-flavored iced tea, but rather through chemistry and biology, and in the 20th and 21st century, they now have an enzyme that you add to whatever the substrate is. I guess maybe like sugar water, and the enzyme, basically the little molecules of the enzyme will ingest, let's say that sugar water or whatever the substrate is, and excrete peach flavor. Right? They've created an enzyme that ingests sugar and excretes peach flavor. Isn't that unbelievable? There's no peach. No peach ever went near that drink, but they have developed a flavor profile that obviously they tested on hundreds or thousands of people, and they all say, yeah, that tastes like peach to me. And so there's no peach in it, but it tastes like peach, at least what people accept as peach in their sugary drinks from the supermarket. So peaches, of course, are permitted, but you could do probably the same thing with, bacon flavor, pork flavor, shrimp flavor, catfish flavor. Catfish is a fish that's not permitted to Jews. Even though it's a fish, it doesn't have both fins and scales, right? So you can make these flavors of the flavor of prohibited substance made in a permitted way that will be kosher. But as we discussed, in terms of the issue of Maris Ayin, you have to be careful that people aren't going to mistake you for eating a prohibited substance either to your detriment or their detriment. Lucy asks, the whole discussion about trying to avoid even minimal amounts of chametz makes me realize that it is nearly impossible to avoid chametz's eating or possession 100%, just like it is also impossible to be 100% humble and not puffed up. Wherever one turns, there could be bits of chametz showing up unexpectedly, concretely or figuratively, in unexpected forms. So there always is the question of mixtures and circumstances that need to be discerned as to their level of possible acceptability or spiritual risk. It's a great point, Lucy, right? So how do we handle that? First of all, that's why we have that recital that we make at the beginning of Passover, at the time that we search out chametz in our homes, and then again on the afternoon, midday or 11 a.m. on the 14th of Nisan, that morning before Passover starts that night, when we're whatever chametz we haven't sold to a non-Jew, so that it is not in our possession, whatever's left over that we keep a little bit to burn in a fire, so that we can sort of fulfill that obligation. But we also recite at that time any chametz that remained in my possession because I didn't find it or I wasn't aware of it. I hereby declare it ownerless, because we acknowledge that we're not going to be able to find all the chametz. It may well happen that something escapes our search, escapes our notice. And I think you're right. Since chametz represents arrogance and our own puffed up natures, no matter how hard we work on becoming humble, it's the nature of a human to view his own desires and needs first before anybody else's, and that can lead to at least a little bit of arrogance. And so, it's something we're always working against and requires learning and study and organization and discipline to address these matters. It's a really good point. And the general comment, Tom Beck says, there's always a however, and there's always an except. Yes, there is. There was a discussion on Facebook somewhere today, maybe on My Jewish Learning and their Daf Yomi page, talking about this, about flavoring, like bacon flavoring derived from an artificial means. And somebody said, we shouldn't have that. We absolutely shouldn't have that because it violates the spirit of the law, right? If the fact God said we shouldn't be eating pork, then why are we eating bacon-flavored potato chips even though they're kosher? And actually, and somebody objected to that statement and made a good argument. And the argument is these laws that God gave us in the Torah, it's to live by them, not to suffer by them. So if the sages can derive a legitimate exception to a law, which for example is going to enhance our Shabbos, right? And so there was, for example, very early on in Jewish history, there was a dispute among the authorities of the day on Shabbos when we're not allowed to kindle fire in our homes. Should we sit in the dark? So, and the sages said, no, of course not. What we should do is we should light Shabbos candles before Shabbos begins so that the home is lit up and joyful on Shabbos. And, we have to light it before Shabbos starts, but it can keep burning during Shabbos. And there were other more, literal-minded people who said, well, it said no fire in the home. You shouldn't kindle fire in the home. So that seems to mean that we shouldn't have a fire burning in the home. And therefore, on Shabbos, we should just sit in the dark, right? And the sages overruled that and said the laws of Shabbos, like all the laws of the Torah, are to live by. A person lives by them, not to die by them, not to suffer by them. So the more we study them and the more we understand them, the fact that we find, exceptions or, Mendy Pellin likes to joke about the loopholer Rebbe, right? He has a comedic character called the loopholer Rebbe. And we can make a joke about, rabbis finding loopholes to these rules. But they don't find them with ease or just, make up a loophole just so that things are easy. Not at all. As a matter of fact, it's a well-established principle that it's much easier to say no, it's prohibited, than to find a way to say yes, it's permitted. It takes great rabbis, right? Because rabbis are a cautious lot, at least traditional rabbis, and they will always just say, if they're not sure, they'll say no, it's permitted, just in case they're wrong. They want you to err on the side of caution. But a rabbi who can find an exception that's going to permit people to do something that they want to do or that they need to do, and it seems to, be a questionable area, and they will dig deep in the law and make very certain that whatever exception they have found is legit. They're not going to just create something that's a convenience or even an equitable answer and pull it out of thin air. They will go to great lengths and great legal analysis to find a legitimate exception. So when we find exceptions to rules, they don't come about lightly. And some rabbi and probably many rabbis over centuries dug deep to find and accredit those exceptions. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, January 5th, 1-year anniversary of this class, AT Daily. And it'll be nice to learn together, and that will be continuing with God's help with page Mem Hey, page 45 here in Tractate Pesachim. You should all have a great